Chapter 1. Every Friday, 8:15 p.m. Friday, 8:15 p.m. Excuse me, this is your station. The sleeping Omega didn't move. Adrian frowned and gently touched his shoulder. Cold. Much too cold. The Omega's eyelids fluttered for a brief moment, and relief crossed Adrian's face. Then a violent cough ripped through the silence. Bright red blood spilled through the Omega's trembling fingers. Gasps echoed across the train. Someone screamed. He's coughing blood. The Omega's body gave out. Adrian lunged forward just in time, catching him before he struck the floor. The young Omega lay limp in his arms, each breath weaker than the last. Call an ambulance, Adrian shouted, his voice shaking for the first time in years. As the train rushed toward the next station, Adrian looked down at the stranger he'd silently shared every Friday evening with for 6 months. He still didn't know the Omega's name. He only knew one thing. He couldn't let him die. 6 months earlier, every Friday at exactly 8:15 p.m., Adrian Hale boarded the last carriage. The first time Adrian Hale noticed the Omega, it wasn't because he was beautiful. It was because everyone else seemed determined not to notice him. The Friday evening train was always crowded for the first few stations. Office workers leaned against doors with tired expressions, students laughed over videos on their phones, and vendors squeezed through the narrow aisles selling bottled water and snacks. The carriage buzzed with the familiar exhaustion of people eager to get home. Adrian disliked noise. After another week of board meetings, negotiations, and decisions that affected thousands of employees, silence felt more luxurious than any penthouse or private jet. Adrian owned luxury cars, and his driver waited outside his office every evening. But every Friday, he sent both home early. Years ago, after his father died from years of overwork, Adrian had made himself one promise: no work after Friday night. Instead of sitting in the back of a car and taking calls, he boarded the 8:15 train because it was the only place where no one expected anything from him. There, he became just another tired passenger. No CEO, no billionaire, no decisions, just 30 quiet minutes between work and home. That was why every Friday, without fail, he boarded the last carriage. It was always the quietest. At exactly 8:15 p.m., the train glided into Central Station. The doors slid open with a mechanical chime. Adrian stepped inside, adjusted the cuffs of his navy suit, and took his usual seat near the back. He loosened his tie by a single finger's width, exhaled softly, and opened the financial reports on his tablet. Routine. Predictable. Comfortable. Then, a gentle breeze carrying the scent of lavender after rain drifted through the carriage. Not sweet enough to overwhelm. Not sharp enough to demand attention. Just peaceful. Across the aisle sat a young Omega. His head rested lightly against the window as if sleep had claimed him long before the train arrived. An oversized cream cardigan swallowed his slender frame, its sleeves hanging past his wrists. A faded canvas bag rested on his lap, one hand loosely holding it even in sleep, as though afraid someone might take it away. A pair of earphones remained in his ears. Soft instrumental music leaked faintly enough that only the closest passenger could hear. His breathing was slow, peaceful, almost childlike. Adrian looked for only a second before returning to his tablet. A college student, perhaps. Nothing more, nothing less. The following Friday, the Omega was there again. Same seat, same cardigan, same canvas bag. Again asleep before the train left the station. Adrian almost smiled. Does he always sleep on trains? He buried himself in spreadsheets. By the time he looked up 20 minutes later, the Omega was still asleep. Not once did he stir. Not even when a child accidentally bumped into his shoulder. Not when the train jolted over old tracks. Not when announcements echoed through the speakers. He simply slept. Deeply. As though the train was the only place in the world where his body finally allowed itself to rest. By the fourth Friday, recognition had replaced curiosity. Without meaning to, Adrian found himself glancing toward the window seat the moment he entered the carriage. There he was, already asleep. Punctual, Adrian thought. More punctual than half my executives. The thought surprised him. He wasn't the sort of man who made observations about strangers. His world revolved around quarterly reports, investment meetings, and contracts. People entered his life because they had appointments scheduled weeks in advance. Yet this Omega appeared every Friday without invitation, like a page in a calendar, unchanging, reliable. One evening, the train lurched violently around a curve. The Omega's sketchbook slipped from his lap and landed on the floor with a soft thud. He didn't wake. Passengers stepped around it without a glance. Adrian hesitated. He could leave it. Someone else might pick it up, or it might be trampled beneath polished shoes. With a quiet sigh, he leaned down, retrieved the worn sketchbook, brushed a bit of dust from its cover, and placed it gently back onto the Omega's lap. The Omega shifted slightly in his sleep. His fingers instinctively curled around the book. A tiny, almost invisible smile touched his lips. No words, just a sleepy sound. Adrian looked away immediately. There, problem solved. He returned to reading his report, pretending he hadn't noticed anything. Winter arrived. The evenings grew colder. Passengers wrapped scarves tighter around their necks. The Omega, however, looked thinner with every passing week. His cheeks became slightly hollow. Dark circles settled beneath his eyes. Sometimes, before sleep claimed him, he pressed a hand against his ribs and closed his eyes as if waiting for a wave of pain to pass. One Friday, Adrian noticed a violent coughing fit just before the train departed. The Omega turned toward the window, covering his mouth with a handkerchief. His shoulders shook. His breathing hitched. When it finally stopped, he quietly folded the cloth and tucked it into his pocket before anyone could see. Then, as always, he leaned against the window, closed his eyes, and fell asleep. Adrian frowned. That cough doesn't sound like a cold. For a fleeting moment, he considered saying something. You should see a doctor. Simple, polite, reasonable. Instead, the announcement for the next station interrupted his thoughts. A passenger asked Adrian for directions. The moment passed like a leaf carried away by the wind. Weeks flowed by, one Friday blending into the next. Without realizing it, Adrian began measuring the end of his workweek not by the meetings he finished, but by whether the familiar window seat was occupied. If it was empty before the train arrived, he found himself wondering if the Omega had missed it. Then, at the last second, the young man would hurry aboard, clutching his canvas bag, offering a shy apology to anyone he accidentally brushed past before settling into his usual seat. Only then would Adrian quietly return to whatever he had been reading. One rainy evening, an elderly beta entered the carriage with trembling legs. Before Adrian could stand to offer his seat, the Omega was already on his feet despite looking exhausted himself. He smiled gently. Please sit here. The elderly man thanked him over and over. The Omega simply nodded and spent the rest of the journey standing, one hand gripping the overhead rail while trying to suppress another cough. Adrian watched from across the aisle. He's barely able to stand himself. Yet he had still given away his seat without hesitation. For reasons Adrian couldn't explain, that small act stayed with him long after he reached home. Exactly 6 months after he first noticed the sleeping Omega, Friday arrived once more. The clock above the platform read 8:15 p.m. The train doors opened. Adrian stepped inside. His eyes moved automatically toward the window seat. The Omega was there, but something was different. His face had lost nearly all its color. His lips were pale. Even from several seats away, Adrian could see that each breath seemed just a little harder to take than the last. The canvas bag rested on his lap. The familiar sketchbook lay beneath one hand. His eyes closed. His head leaned against the cold glass. Within moments, he drifted into sleep. Adrian looked at him longer than usual. A quiet, inexplicable unease settled in his chest. For the first time in 6 months, a thought refused to leave him. I hope he wakes up at his station. Outside, rain streaked across the train windows like blurred silver threads. The train rolled steadily into the darkness. Neither of the two strangers knew that this ordinary Friday was about to change both of their lives forever. Chapter 2. The Friday That Didn't End. The train raced through the city, its rhythmic clatter blending with the soft hum of the air conditioner. Inside the last carriage, silence settled naturally. Several passengers scrolled through their phones. A university student revised notes before an exam. An exhausted mother gently rocked her sleeping child. Adrian tried to focus on the quarterly report glowing on his tablet. Numbers, forecasts, profit margins. Every figure that usually demanded his complete attention now blurred together. His eyes drifted upward. The Omega hadn't moved. His head still rested against the cool window, loose strands of dark hair falling across his forehead. The oversized cardigan looked even larger on his shrinking frame, as though it belonged to someone healthier. The train announced the next station. This was the stop where the Omega always got off. Always. The brakes hissed. The doors slid open. Passengers stepped onto the platform. Fresh commuters boarded. The familiar electronic chime echoed. The doors closed. The train began moving again. The Omega remained asleep. Adrian looked up from his tablet. A faint crease appeared between his brows. Maybe he's just tired today. He lowered his gaze again. 5 minutes later. Another station. More passengers left. The Omega still hadn't moved. Adrian's fingers stopped tapping against the screen. Something wasn't right. The elderly conductor walked through the carriage checking tickets. As he approached the Omega, he smiled kindly. Young man. No response. The conductor chuckled. Must have had a long day. He continued down the aisle without another thought. Adrian watched the exchange in silence. Should I wake him? It wasn't really his business. People miss their stops all the time. Perhaps the Omega would wake at the next station and simply catch the train back. There was no reason to interfere. Yet, that uneasy feeling only grew heavier. The city lights outside gradually disappeared. Towering office buildings gave way to quiet neighborhoods. Then smaller stations. The carriage emptied. Only 5 passengers remained. The familiar lavender after rain scent lingered faintly in the cool air. The Omega's breathing sounded different. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just shallow. Each breath seemed to travel a little farther than it should. As though his body had forgotten how. Adrian closed his tablet. He couldn't ignore it anymore. The announcement rang through the carriage. Next station, Riverside. Final stop before Central Depot. Only 2 passengers stood and exited. Now, the last carriage held just 3 people. Adrian, the sleeping Omega, and an old man reading a newspaper. The train started moving again. Still, no movement from the Omega. Not even a twitch. Adrian stood. He crossed the aisle slowly, careful not to startle him. Up close, the Omega looked even paler than before. Tiny beads of sweat clung to his forehead despite the cool air. His lips had taken on a faint bluish tint. Adrian's heartbeat quickened. He cleared his throat softly. Excuse me. Nothing. He tried again, a little louder. Excuse me. This isn't your station. Silence. The old man lowered his newspaper, watching curiously. Adrian hesitated only a second before gently touching the Omega's shoulder. The fabric beneath his hand felt cold. Far colder than it should. The Omega's body leaned forward slightly from the touch. His eyelids fluttered. For one hopeful heartbeat, Adrian thought he was waking. Instead, a violent cough tore through his body. The Omega doubled over, one trembling hand flying to his mouth. A dark stain spread across his sleeve. Blood. Bright. Fresh. The old man gasped. Oh my God. The Omega tried desperately to breathe. Another cough. More blood slipped between his fingers. His entire body shook violently before going frighteningly limp. Hey! Adrian caught him before he collapsed onto the floor. The Omega's head rested against Adrian's shoulder. His breathing was barely audible. His pulse raced beneath fragile skin. The train's emergency intercom crackled as the conductor rushed in. What happened? Call an ambulance, Adrian said, his voice calm despite the storm inside him. Now. The conductor froze for half a second at the sight of the blood. Then he grabbed the emergency phone. The train skipped its normal schedule. Permission was granted to stop at the nearest station. The moment the doors opened, paramedics rushed inside carrying equipment. Male Omega, mid-20s, Adrian reported quickly. Collapsed after coughing blood. Barely responsive. One medic checked his pulse. Another fitted an oxygen mask. A third asked urgently, "Are you family?" Adrian answered without hesitation. "No. Friend. No." The medic looked between them briefly before nodding. "Will you ride with him? We need someone who saw what happened." "Yes." There wasn't even a moment of doubt. The ambulance screamed through the rain-soaked streets. Blue lights reflected across the windows like waves of shattered glass. Inside, machines beeped in uneven rhythms. One paramedic adjusted the oxygen mask. Another started in 4. The Omega never opened his eyes. His fingers twitched weakly once, then fell still again. Adrian sat opposite the stretcher, his suit stained with small spots of blood. He stared at the young man he'd silently shared train rides with for 6 months. He realized something strange. He didn't know his name. Not even that. Yet the thought of this quiet stranger dying alone in an ambulance felt unbearably wrong. The paramedic looked up from the monitor. His condition is critical. Adrian remained silent. Outside, rain hammered against the ambulance roof. Inside, the only sound was the steady wail of the siren, cutting through the night as though racing against time itself. For the first time in years, Adrian found himself wishing with all his heart for the survival of someone who had never spoken a single word to him. Chapter 3. A Name at Last. The ambulance doors burst open. Doctors and nurses were already waiting. Male Omega, approximately 25. Massive hemoptysis. Oxygen saturation dropping. Possible respiratory failure. The stretcher disappeared through the emergency room doors. Adrian followed until a nurse stopped him. "I'm sorry, sir. Only family members beyond this point." The words caught in his throat. He wasn't family. He wasn't even a friend. He was just a stranger who happened to be on the same train. "I understand." The automatic doors slid shut between them. For the first time in a long while, Adrian found himself with absolutely nothing to do. No meeting to attend. No problem to solve. No deal to negotiate. Only waiting. The waiting room smelled of disinfectant and freshly brewed coffee. A television mounted on the wall played the late-night news. Nobody was watching. Adrian looked down at his sleeves. Tiny crimson stains had dried against the expensive navy fabric. Noah's blood. Without thinking, he rubbed at one of the stains with his thumb. It didn't come off. He remembered how cold Noah's shoulder had felt. How frighteningly light he had been when Adrian caught him. Has he always been that thin? The thought came uninvited. Then another. How long has he been sick? He realized he had watched this Omega every Friday for half a year. Yet he had never truly looked. Nearly an hour passed. A doctor finally stepped into the waiting room. Who came with the patient? Adrian stood immediately. "I did." The doctor gave a tired nod. "We've managed to stop the bleeding for now, but his condition is extremely serious." Adrian remained silent. The damage to his lungs is extensive. This isn't something that happened overnight. So, he's been ill for a long time. The doctor's voice softened. Much longer than most people around him probably realized. Adrian felt something tighten painfully inside his chest. The coughing, the exhaustion, the pale face, the trembling hands. The clues had been there every single Friday. He had simply accepted them as part of the scenery. "We still don't know his medical history," the doctor continued. "He arrived without anyone to contact. No family. We don't know yet." The doctor glanced toward the emergency room. "We're hoping there's identification in his belongings." A nurse approached carrying a clear plastic bag. Inside were the Omega's belongings. A faded canvas shoulder bag. A wallet. A phone with a cracked screen. A small lunchbox, still unopened. A bottle of medication. An inhaler. A neatly folded cream cardigan that had been stained during treatment. The nurse sighed quietly. There wasn't an emergency contact saved on his phone. She opened the wallet. One identification card slipped out. She read it aloud. Noah Ellis. The name settled into the silence. Noah. At last. The quiet Omega on the Friday train had a name. Adrian repeated it silently. Noah. For some reason, it suited him perfectly. Gentle. Simple. Easy to remember. The nurse continued searching for insurance documents. Instead, she found a worn blue notebook tucked carefully into the inner pocket of the canvas bag. Unlike everything else, it had been wrapped inside a transparent zip pouch to protect it from the rain. Its edges were worn smooth from years of handling. The nurse smiled faintly. He really wanted to keep this safe. She flipped open the cover. No emergency phone number. No medical information. Just neat handwriting on the first page. She frowned. It doesn't look important. She started to place it back. Something made Adrian glance toward the open page. Only one sentence had been written there, in careful blue ink. For the man who rides the Friday train in the Navy suit. Adrian froze. The nurse noticed his expression. Do you know who that is? He couldn't answer. His heartbeat suddenly echoed louder than the hospital monitors. The nurse looked between the notebook and Adrian's suit. Then, at the perfectly tailored Navy jacket he was still wearing. Her eyes widened ever so slightly. Sir. Adrian slowly reached for the notebook, almost afraid to touch it. His fingers hovered over the worn cover. The room around him seemed to disappear. The television, the footsteps, the conversations. Everything faded beneath one impossible realization. The notebook was about him. He hadn't even opened it yet. And somehow, his life had already changed. Chapter 4. The Blue Notebook. For several long moments, Adrian simply stared at the notebook. Its blue cover was faded around the edges, the corners softened by years of being carried everywhere. A tiny silver star sticker clung stubbornly to one corner, nearly peeled away with age. It didn't look like something that could change a person's life, yet it already had. The nurse gently placed it in Adrian's hands. If a family member arrives, we'll need all of his belongings back. Adrian nodded absent-mindedly. Of course. His fingers tightened around the notebook. He had no right to read it. It was someone's private thoughts. Someone who had never given permission. He glanced toward the intensive care unit. Beyond those closed doors, Noah lay unconscious, breathing only because machines were helping him. Would he be angry if I read it? Another thought answered almost immediately. What if there's something inside that could help him? Someone he wanted us to contact? Something important. With quiet hesitation, Adrian opened the first page. The handwriting was surprisingly neat. Every letter was carefully formed, as though Noah believed words deserved to be treated gently. At the top of the page was a date. Friday, March 7th. Beneath it, today I noticed the man in the navy suit again. Adrian blinked. Again. He kept reading. He always boards at exactly 8:15. I think he's never been late. Maybe he's one of those people who plan every minute of their day. A faint smile tugged at Adrian's lips. That part was true. He couldn't remember the last time he'd been late for anything. The next line made him pause. He looks intimidating until he sits down. Then he loosens his tie just a little, like he's finally allowing himself to breathe. Almost unconsciously, Adrian touched the knot of his tie. He had done exactly that every Friday. He hadn't realized anyone was watching. He turned the page. Another Friday. Another entry. Today he looked exhausted. He rubbed his forehead 3 times before opening his tablet. I wonder if someone is making him work too hard. Adrian let out a soft, humorless laugh. If only you knew I was the one making those schedules. The smile faded quickly. Noah hadn't written about an important businessman. He had written about a tired man. Nothing more. Nothing less. Another page. An elderly woman couldn't reach her bag from the luggage rack. Before anyone else noticed, he stood up and helped her. He didn't wait for her to thank him. He just sat back down and kept reading. Adrian frowned slightly. He barely remembered that. It had taken less than 10 seconds. He had forgotten it before reaching home. Noah hadn't. Another page. The handwriting was a little brighter, almost playful. I learned something today. He drinks black coffee. Adrian looked confused. How could you know that? The answer came in the next sentence. He accidentally left the lid open. The whole carriage smelled like coffee for a minute. A tiny chuckle escaped him. The memory returned. He had spilled a little coffee on one particularly hectic Friday. He had been embarrassed. Meanwhile, someone had turned it into a diary entry. He kept reading, page after page, week after week. There were no dramatic confessions, no desperate declarations of love, no fantasies, only ordinary moments. Moments Adrian himself had forgotten. Today he smiled at a little girl who waved at him through the train window. He probably doesn't even remember smiling, but she laughed all the way until her station. His shoes are always polished. I wonder if he does that himself or if someone helps him. He fell asleep for 3 minutes today. I almost laughed because he looked much younger when he wasn't frowning. Adrian covered his mouth with one hand. 3 minutes. He remembered that meeting. He had been awake for nearly 36 hours. He hadn't even known he'd fallen asleep. Yet Noah had noticed. As the pages continued, Adrian realized something strange. Noah never once described himself. Not his own illness. Not his loneliness. Not his difficult days. The notebook wasn't a diary. It was a collection of little moments that made Noah smile. And somehow, nearly every one of those moments involved Adrian. Near the middle of the notebook, Adrian found a page with no date. Only a simple sentence. It's funny how a stranger can become part of your routine without ever knowing your name. Beneath it, in much smaller handwriting, I hope life is kind to him. Adrian stopped breathing for a moment. Noah didn't know his name, didn't know where he worked, didn't know whether he was married, didn't know if he was happy. Yet, every Friday, he silently wished him well. A man Adrian had never spoken to, had been hoping for his happiness. The realization settled over him like a heavy blanket. When was the last time anyone had wished him happiness without expecting something in return? He couldn't remember. A soft knock interrupted the silence. Adrian looked up. The doctor stood at the doorway. We've transferred Noah to the intensive care unit. He hasn't woken up? The doctor slowly shook his head. Not yet. Can I see him? The doctor hesitated. Only for a few minutes. Adrian carefully closed the notebook. For the first time since picking it up, he didn't hold it like a stranger's belonging. He held it like a promise. A promise that if Noah opened his eyes again, Adrian wouldn't let another Friday pass in silence. Chapter 5. The Man Behind the Pages. The intensive care unit was quieter than the rest of the hospital. Even the footsteps seemed softer here. Machines hummed steadily. Monitors blinked with quiet determination. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic and clean linen. A nurse led Adrian to the last room. Please don't stay longer than 5 minutes. He nodded. I won't. The door opened with a gentle click. Noah lay motionless beneath a white blanket. An oxygen tube rested beneath his nose, and 4-line disappeared beneath the sleeve of his hospital gown. The cardigan he always wore on Fridays was gone. Without it, he looked even younger, smaller, fragile enough that the large hospital bed seemed built for someone else. Adrian had spent 6 months believing Noah slept peacefully on the train. Now he realized he had simply been exhausted. Exhausted from fighting an illness no one else could see. Adrian pulled a chair beside the bed. For a long moment, he said nothing. He had never been good at speaking when there was no business to discuss. Finally, almost awkwardly, he murmured, So, I know your name now. A tiny smile appeared. Noah. The room remained silent. I suppose it's only fair. My name is Adrian. He laughed quietly at himself. You probably already knew that. Then he remembered. Noah didn't know. The notebook had never mentioned his name. Only the man in the Navy suit. His eyes drifted back to the blue notebook. He opened another page. The entries had begun changing. Instead of simply describing Adrian, Noah had started writing about Fridays themselves. I think Fridays are my favorite day now. Not because of the hospital appointment. Those are always scary. Because no matter how tired I am afterward, I know the train ride home will be peaceful. Adrian frowned. Hospital appointment? Every Friday? His eyes continued downward. The doctors always look worried before they smile at me. I don't think they realize I can tell the difference. The sentence lingered in the room. No self-pity. No anger. Just quiet observation. Another page. Today's test results weren't good. The nurse apologized before she even spoke. I think people forget that silence tells the truth long before words do. Adrian slowly looked toward Noah. Had he boarded the train after hearing bad news, only to spend the journey pretending to sleep? Another page. The medicine is becoming expensive. Maybe I should stop buying coffee on Fridays. Although, the warm cup makes my hands hurt less. Adrian swallowed hard. Coffee. The simple luxury Noah had debated giving up. Meanwhile, Adrian had spent more on one business lunch than Noah probably spent in an entire week. The contrast made him deeply uncomfortable. The next few entries became increasingly difficult to read. Not because the words were dramatic. Because they weren't. I had to rest halfway up the hospital stairs today. The coughing is getting worse. I smiled at the receptionist so she wouldn't worry. I wonder if pretending to be okay eventually becomes the same as being okay. Adrian closed his eyes. That sentence hurt far more than any tearful confession could have. A soft knock interrupted him. The same nurse from earlier entered carrying a small paper bag. Mr. Hale? Yes. We found this in Mr. Ellis's locker. She placed it on the table. It's from the outpatient clinic. Inside were receipts, prescription slips, medical reports, and an envelope. Across the front, written in careful handwriting, were the words, "If I'm ever admitted unexpectedly." The nurse carefully opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. No emergency contacts. No family members. Just one request. Please don't let my landlord throw away my sketchbooks. The nurse lowered the page. Her eyes had turned red. That's... She couldn't finish the sentence. Adrian stared at the paper. Not, call my parents. Not, notify my brother. Not, tell someone I love them. Only, please don't throw away my sketchbooks. As though Noah believed there would be no one left to protect the only pieces of himself he'd leave behind. The loneliness of that realization was almost unbearable. The nurse quietly spoke. We contacted the address on his identification. Did someone answer? An elderly woman. She smiled sadly. She isn't family. She's his landlady. She said. The nurse looked down. She'll come tomorrow morning. She also said she thought Mr. Ellis was staying overnight at the hospital after his appointment. Adrian looked at Noah. So no one knew? The nurse shook her head. He didn't want people worrying. After she left, silence returned. Adrian looked at the unconscious Omega for a long time. Then, almost without thinking, he reached toward Noah's hand. He stopped just before touching it. Was that crossing a line? Perhaps. But leaving him alone somehow felt worse. Gently, very gently, he wrapped his hand around Noah's cool fingers. They were impossibly light. I've been reading your notebook, Adrian admitted quietly. I know I probably shouldn't have. His thumb brushed against Noah's knuckles. But his voice became softer. You spent 6 months making sure a complete stranger didn't travel home alone. So, he looked at the sleeping Omega, whose expression remained peaceful despite everything. Until you wake up. I don't think you should be alone either. Outside the hospital window, dawn's first pale light began to wash away the darkness. For the first time in years, Adrian didn't think about the meetings waiting for him that morning. He only hoped that when Friday came again, the seat by the train window wouldn't stay empty forever. Chapter 6. The Little Apartment with the Blue Door. Adrian didn't go to the office the next morning. His assistant called 3 times. His board of directors sent messages asking if the morning meeting should be postponed. For the first time since becoming CEO, Adrian ignored every notification. He remained beside Noah until the doctors assured him that the Omega's condition had stabilized. Not improved. Only stable. It wasn't good news. But it wasn't goodbye either. Just before noon, a nurse approached. Mr. Hale? Yes. Someone is here to see Mr. Ellis. Adrian stood. An elderly woman, perhaps in her late 70s, slowly walked into the corridor carrying a faded floral umbrella. Her gray hair was tied into a neat bun. She wore an old knitted sweater despite the warm weather. The moment she saw Noah through the ICU window, her shoulders sagged. Oh, my poor boy. She covered her mouth. I knew he looked thinner last week. But he smiled so brightly. He told me the doctors were only changing his medicine. A tear slipped down her wrinkled cheek. Adrian quietly stepped closer. Are you Mrs.? She nodded. Mrs. Agnes. I'm his landlady. She gave a tiny laugh filled with sadness. Though Noah insists on calling me Grandma Agnes. The two of them sat together in the waiting area. Mrs. Agnes twisted a handkerchief in her hands. He has lived in my apartment building for almost 4 years. He always paid his rent. Sometimes a little late. But he always apologized as if he'd committed a terrible crime. Her smile trembled. He baked me cinnamon cookies every Christmas. They were always a little burnt. But I told him they were perfect. She chuckled softly. I don't think he ever believed me. Adrian listened quietly. Each story felt like another piece of Noah returning to life. He never complained, Mrs. Agnes continued. Not once. Even when climbing the stairs left him breathless. I offered to move him to the first floor. He refused. Someone else might need it more than me, he said. She shook her head. That boy. He worried about everyone except himself. After a long silence, she looked at Adrian. You were with him? Yes. Family? No. A friend. Adrian hesitated. Not exactly. Mrs. Agnes smiled knowingly. Noah made another friend then. The word stung. Because Adrian knew the truth. He hadn't been Noah's friend. Not yet. He had only become part of Noah's story without realizing it. Mrs. Agnes reached into her handbag. I almost forgot. She handed Adrian a small brass key. This is Noah's apartment key. He'd be upset if someone watered his plants too late. Adrian blinked. You want me to? I can't climb 3 flights of stairs anymore. And? She looked toward the ICU. I think you'd like to see how he lived. That afternoon, Adrian stood before a modest brick apartment building tucked between a laundromat and an old bookstore. The paint was peeling. The mailbox leaned slightly to one side. Children's bicycles rested near the entrance. Nothing about the building suggested it housed the quiet young man who had unknowingly changed Adrian's life. Apartment 3B. The blue door. Adrian unlocked it. A soft click echoed. He stepped inside. The apartment was tiny. 1 room. A kitchenette. A narrow balcony. Everything was spotless. Not because it was luxurious. Because someone had cared for it with love. Sunlight streamed through thin white curtains. Several small potted plants lined the windowsill. Some were blooming. Others struggled but were still alive. Beside the window sat a worn wooden desk. Pencils, paintbrushes, watercolor stains, half-finished sketches. stacks of notebooks. The room smelled faintly of paper, tea, and lavender after rain. The same comforting scent that had drifted through the train every Friday. Adrian slowly walked farther inside. Nothing expensive, nothing unnecessary. Just a life. Simple, quiet, honest. On the bookshelf stood dozens of sketchbooks arranged by year. One spine read, age 20. Another, age 21. Then, age 22. Every year of Noah's adult life had been drawn instead of written. Curiosity gently tugged at Adrian. He opened one. The first sketch showed Mrs. Agnes sleeping in a chair while knitting. Beneath it, Noah had written, Grandma Agnes says she wasn't sleeping. She absolutely was. Adrian laughed. A genuine laugh. His first in days. The next sketch showed a stray orange cat stealing bread from a bakery. Another showed two children sharing an umbrella much too small for both of them. Another, a conductor asleep during his lunch break. Noah had filled page after page with ordinary people. Not because they were extraordinary, because he believed ordinary moments deserved to be remembered. Then Adrian reached the newest sketchbook. His breath caught. The first page showed a familiar train carriage. The second, a man in a navy suit reading a tablet. The third, the same man helping an elderly passenger. The fourth, that man asleep, his tie slightly loosened, sunlight warming one side of his face. Every drawing had been made with astonishing tenderness. Not the tenderness of obsession, the tenderness of gratitude. As if Noah had been quietly saying, "Thank you for making my Fridays less lonely." Adrian gently traced the edge of one page. His voice was barely a whisper. You saw so much. His eyes drifted around the little apartment. The lonely blue door. The tiny kitchen. The carefully watered plants. The stack of unfinished drawings. The half-read library book still lying open on the bedside table. Every object silently waited for Noah to come home. None of them knew how close they had come to never seeing him again. Adrian closed the sketchbook carefully and looked out the window. Tomorrow would be Friday. For the first time in 6 months. The train would leave at 8:15 without Noah. And somehow, that thought made the entire city feel quieter. Chapter 7. The Empty Seat. Friday arrived. At 7:42 p.m., Adrian closed the file in front of him. His executives exchanged surprised glances. The meeting wasn't over. Usually, Adrian would continue until every detail had been resolved. Instead, he stood. We'll finish on Monday. One manager blinked. But, sir, the investors from Singapore. They can wait. The room fell silent. For the first time in anyone's memory, Adrian Hale had chosen something over work. No one knew that somewhere across the city, an unconscious Omega was fighting for another breath. The evening air carried the scent of rain. Adrian bought 2 cups of black coffee from the kiosk outside the station. Then he stopped. A memory surfaced from the notebook. Maybe I should stop buying coffee on Fridays. He looked at the second cup for a long moment, then quietly handed it to an exhausted security guard standing nearby. You look like you need this more than I do. The guard stared in surprise. Thank you, sir. Adrian simply nodded and walked toward platform 4 with 1 cup still warming his hands. 8:15 p.m. The familiar chime echoed. The train doors slid open. Adrian stepped into the last carriage. Automatically, his eyes turned toward the window seat. Empty. The cream cardigan wasn't there. The faded canvas bag wasn't resting on anyone's lap. No lavender after rain scent drifted through the carriage. Only an ordinary empty seat. He sat across from it. The train began moving. For the first time in 6 months. The journey felt unbearably long. Every station carried a memory. At Maple Street. This is where he always boarded if the hospital appointment ran late. At Riverside. An elderly passenger had smiled because Noah offered his seat. At Ashford. His sketchbook slipped here. Adrian hadn't realized he'd memorized Noah's routine. Yet every stop whispered another piece of it back to him. The city outside remained exactly the same. Only one passenger was missing. And somehow, everything had changed. Halfway through the journey, a young mother entered with a little boy no older than 5. The carriage was nearly full. There were no empty seats. Before Adrian could stand, the child pointed toward the empty window seat. Mama, can I sit there? His mother smiled apologetically. If nobody's using it. The little boy climbed onto the seat happily. He pressed his forehead against the glass, watching the city lights race by. Exactly the way Noah always had. Adrian found himself smiling despite the ache in his chest. He'd like that, he thought. He never believed a seat belonged to him. When the train reached Noah's usual station, the doors opened with their familiar hiss. People stepped off. Others stepped on. The little boy waved enthusiastically at someone standing on the platform. Then the train moved again. Adrian looked out the window. For 6 months, this had been the place where Noah disappeared into the crowd. He had never once wondered where Noah walked afterward. Now he knew. 3 streets. A small bakery. An old bookstore. The apartment with the blue door. A life had existed there all along. A life Adrian had walked past without seeing. By the time the train reached the final station, almost everyone had left. The carriage was nearly silent. Adrian remained seated. He looked at the empty seat one last time. Then he quietly spoke, almost embarrassed by the sound of his own voice. "I read more of your notebook." A cleaning attendant nearby glanced at him, assuming he was on the phone. He wasn't. "I learned you can't bake cookies." A faint smile crossed his face. "You were terrible at it." He imagined Noah's horrified expression if he'd heard that. The thought almost made him laugh. "Almost. I also learned you watered your plants every Thursday." So, he looked toward the dark window. "I watered them yesterday." His reflection stared back at him, for the first time in years. It didn't look like the face of a successful CEO. It looked like a lonely man talking to someone who couldn't answer. The next morning, Adrian returned to the hospital. Before visiting Noah, he stopped at a florist. Rows of bright flowers filled the shop. The florist smiled. "Looking for roses?" Adrian shook his head. "No. Lilies." He remembered another notebook entry. "Lilies after rain smell like hope." "Yes," Adrian said quietly. "White lilies." The florist wrapped them carefully in soft paper. "They're for someone important." Adrian looked at the bouquet for a moment, then answered with complete honesty. "Someone I'm only beginning to know." When Adrian entered the ICU room, Noah was exactly as he'd left him. Still, quiet. The steady rhythm of the heart monitor filled the room. Adrian placed the lilies in a vase by the window. The fragrance slowly spread through the room. Fresh, gentle, like the first rain after a long summer. He pulled the chair closer, opened the blue notebook, and smiled. "Good morning, Noah. I think it's your turn to hear your own story." He turned to the first page, the page that had started everything. Then, in a calm voice, he began reading aloud. "Today I noticed the man in the navy suit again." As Adrian read, the room seemed less empty. The words Noah had once written in solitude now returned to their author, carried back by the very man who had unknowingly inspired them. Outside the ICU window, rain began to fall in soft silver threads. Inside, for the first time since collapsing on the train, Noah was no longer facing the silence alone. Chapter 8, reading Fridays back to him. The next Friday, Adrian arrived at the hospital at 7:30 p.m. One of the younger nurses looked up from the reception desk and smiled. "You're early today." "I am. You've been coming every evening." She laughed softly. "And every Friday, almost at the exact same time." Adrian looked at the clock. He hadn't noticed. His body had memorized the schedule before his mind had, the same way it had once memorized the train. When he entered Noah's room, the white lilies were still blooming. The nurses had changed the water. The sunlight had faded into a soft orange glow. Noah looked exactly the same. Peaceful. Too peaceful. Adrian pulled out the chair. "Good evening." There was no reply. He smiled to himself. "I don't know why I keep saying that." He opened the notebook. "I suppose good manners shouldn't depend on whether someone answers." He turned another page. Friday, April 11th. Today the train stopped for almost 15 minutes because of a signal problem. Everyone complained. The man in the navy suit didn't. He simply looked out the window. I wonder what he was thinking about. Adrian chuckled. "I remember that." He looked toward Noah. "I wasn't thinking about anything profound. My presentation file had disappeared. I was trying to remember if I'd accidentally deleted it." He shook his head. "You gave me far too much credit." The heart monitor continued its steady rhythm. Beep, beep, beep. As the days passed, talking became easier. Adrian told Noah about ridiculous meetings. About an executive who tried to hide a disastrous report by changing the font color. About his assistant, who had finally admitted she scheduled coffee breaks because otherwise he forgot to eat. One afternoon he sighed. "I found something interesting." He reached into his briefcase. "My employees are afraid of me." He paused. "I didn't know." A nurse passing the doorway smiled. "They are. Adrian looked genuinely surprised. They've told you. They've told everyone. Even Noah's sleeping face seemed as though it might be hiding a smile. A week later, Adrian visited the apartment again. The plants were thriving. One tiny cactus wore a crooked ribbon tied around it. There was a handwritten label stuck into the soil. Sir Prickles. Very brave. Very dramatic. Adrian blinked, then laughed out loud. You named a cactus? He looked around the empty apartment. You really were impossible. The laughter lingered in the quiet room longer than he expected. While watering the plants, something slipped from between two books on the shelf. A folded piece of paper. It landed at his feet. Across the front, Noah had written, "Things that made me smile this month." Inside wasn't a diary. It was a list. 1. Grandma Agnes won another argument with the bakery owner. 2. A pigeon stole someone's sandwich. 3. The library finally bought the novel I'd requested. 4. My cough didn't wake me up one night. 5. The man in the navy suit smiled. Just once. But he smiled. Adrian stared at the fifth line for a very long time. He couldn't remember smiling. Not because it hadn't happened, because it had been so insignificant to him. To Noah, it had become one of the happiest moments of an entire month. Adrian folded the paper carefully and slipped it back exactly where he'd found it. This belongs here, he whispered. That evening, as he sat beside Noah again, he studied the sleeping Omega's face. The dark circles had faded slightly. The color had returned to his lips, if only a little. The doctors still refused to make promises, but they no longer spoke with the same hopeless tone. One of them quietly admitted, "He's stronger than we expected." Adrian looked at Noah with a small smile. "I could have told you that." He leaned back in his chair. "You know, I've been thinking. If you wake up." He stopped, then corrected himself. "When you wake up, we'll have to start over. You don't know me. I barely know you. I've learned your favorite flowers. Your terrible baking. The names of your plants. You know?" He laughed quietly. "That's a very uneven friendship." He looked at Noah's relaxed hand resting on the blanket. "So, when you wake up, you'll have to tell me your favorite food, and your favorite movie, and why you thought naming a cactus was a good idea." His smile softened into something warmer. "And I'd like to know what your voice sounds like when you're awake." The room became still again. Outside, rain tapped gently against the glass. Inside, Adrian rested his hand lightly beside Noah's on the blanket. Not holding it, just close enough that, if Noah reached out, their fingers would meet. Then, for the first time since the ambulance ride, something happened. Noah's fingertips moved, just barely, a tiny twitch, so small that Adrian wondered if he'd imagined it. He sat upright instantly. "Noah." The fingers became still once more. The heart monitor continued its steady rhythm. But Adrian's own heart was no longer calm. For the first time, hope no longer felt like a distant dream. It felt like someone, somewhere behind closed eyes, had quietly heard him. Chapter 9, the last page. It was another Friday, 8:15 p.m. Adrian sat in the familiar chair beside Noah's hospital bed. The blue notebook rested on his lap. Outside, rain whispered softly against the window, as if the city itself remembered the rhythm of the train. Adrian smiled faintly. "You know, I never liked Fridays. They meant longer meetings, unfinished reports, and another week disappearing before I noticed." He looked at Noah. "Now they're the only day I look forward to." Noah remained still. The only answer was the quiet beeping of the heart monitor. Adrian opened the notebook. Only one page remained. The handwriting was shakier than any page before it. Some words were smudged, as though Noah had paused often while writing. At the top, Friday, September 5th. The doctor told me today that I should stop taking the train. He said my body needs rest. I smiled and promised I'd think about it. Adrian smiled sadly. "You never intended to listen." He continued reading. "If this really is my last Friday on the train, I hope the man in the navy suit has a happy life." Adrian swallowed. His throat suddenly felt too tight. "I hope he keeps loosening his tie after work." A tear blurred the words. "I hope someone waits for him at home." Another tear slipped onto the page. "He deserves that kind of happiness." Adrian closed his eyes. For the first time in years, someone had wished for his happiness without asking for anything in return. Not his money, not his influence, not his time, just his happiness. His voice became almost a whisper as he read the final sentence. "Thank you for unknowingly becoming the brightest part of my Fridays." Silence. The notebook had ended. There were no more pages. No more Fridays. No more words. Adrian slowly closed the cover. His fingers rested on the worn blue notebook for a long time. Then he stood and placed it carefully on the bedside table. So, he looked at Noah. I guess you forgot one Friday. His smile trembled. So let me tell you how it went. He pulled his chair closer. The man in the navy suit finally learned your name. He laughed quietly through wet eyes. It took him 6 months. He can negotiate billion-dollar contracts. But apparently introducing himself was too difficult. His hand gently covered Noah's. And his voice cracked. He visits your grandmother every Sunday now. Sir Prickles is still alive. The bakery owner finally admitted her cinnamon rolls are better than yours. A watery laugh escaped him. I've been watering your plants. They're doing much better than I am. He lowered his head. There was nothing left to hide anymore. And somewhere along the way, I stopped coming here because I felt responsible. I stopped coming because I felt guilty. He tightened his fingers around Noah's hand. I come because a tear landed softly on the back of Noah's hand. I've fallen in love with the Omega who always slept on the Friday train. The room became perfectly still. Adrian closed his eyes. I know you can't hear me, but I wanted someone to tell you. You spent 6 months hoping I'd find happiness. My happiness. His thumb brushed gently across Noah's knuckles. Is lying right here. A faint pressure touched his hand. Tiny. Almost impossible to notice. Adrian froze. He looked down. Noah's fingers had curled around his. Ever so slightly. Adrian's breath caught. Noah. The eyelids that had remained closed for so many days fluttered weakly. Once. Then again. Slowly. 2 tired amber eyes opened. They struggled to focus beneath the bright hospital lights. His lips parted. His voice was little more than a breath. He swallowed painfully. Wasn't pretending. Adrian stared, unable to move. Noah's lips curved into the faintest smile. I really was sleeping. For one heartbeat. Adrian simply looked at him. Then he laughed. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just a quiet laugh filled with relief, gratitude, and disbelief all at once. Tears continued to fall as he gently squeezed Noah's hand. I know. He shook his head with another small laugh. I just wanted to hear your voice. Noah blinked slowly, his eyes still heavy with exhaustion. Is Friday over? Adrian smiled. Yes. Noah looked at him with sleepy confusion. Did I miss my stop? Adrian leaned a little closer, his eyes shining. No. You finally arrived. Outside, the rain eased. For the first time, the silence between them was no longer the silence of strangers. It was the beginning of a conversation that had waited 6 long months for its first word. Chapter 10. Learning each other awake. The first thing Noah noticed after waking up was that the man from the train was real. Not a dream. Not a fever-induced memory. Not something his tired mind had created during the long darkness. He was actually there, sitting beside his bed, wearing the same kind of navy suit. Although now, the tie was slightly crooked. Noah stared at it for a few seconds. Adrian noticed. What? Noah's voice was weak, barely more than a whisper. Your tie? Adrian looked down, then laughed softly. You noticed that before asking how you nearly scared everyone to death. Noah's eyes closed briefly. I was curious. A small smile appeared. The notebook was right. Adrian raised an eyebrow. About what? You always loosen it after work. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Adrian smiled. You were watching me that closely? Noah's cheeks immediately warmed. No. A pause. Maybe. The doctors were cautiously optimistic. Noah's awakening was a good sign, but recovery would be difficult. His body had been exhausted for a long time. There would be medications, therapy, many slow days. But there was something different now. Before, Noah had been fighting alone. Now, someone was waiting beside him. A few days later, Adrian finally asked the question that had been sitting in his mind. Why didn't you tell anyone you were this sick? Noah looked toward the window. The city moved below them. I didn't want people to worry. Adrian frowned slightly. You were coughing blood on a train. Noah looked embarrassed. That sounds worse when you say it. It was worse. Noah lowered his eyes. For a moment, the playful expression disappeared. I spent a lot of my life being the person everyone worried about. My parents worried. My doctors worried. My friends worried. His fingers lightly touched the blanket. I didn't want the last thing people saw when they looked at me to be my illness. Adrian went quiet. Because he understood. Noah didn't hide his pain because he didn't trust people. He hid it because he didn't want his entire identity to become pain. A small smile returned to Noah's face. Also, Adrian looked at him. What? You weren't supposed to read the notebook. Adrian looked guilty. I know. You invaded my privacy. I know. Noah studied him, then softly said, I'm glad you did. Adrian looked surprised. Why? Noah glanced toward the blue notebook sitting on the bedside table. Because I wrote those things for myself. I thought they would disappear with me. His voice became quieter. But now someone remembers. The words stayed between them. Simple, but heavier than any confession. That evening, Adrian brought something unexpected. Noah stared at the object in his hands. My sketchbook. Adrian nodded. I found it at your apartment. Noah looked horrified. You went to my apartment? Mrs. Agnes gave me the key. Noah covered his face weakly. She did what? Adrian smiled. Apparently, she trusts me. She met you once. She said I looked like someone who needed taking care of. Noah blinked, then laughed. A real laugh. Quiet and fragile, but real. Adrian froze, because he realized something. This was the first time he had heard Noah laugh. Not imagined, not read about. Heard. Noah opened the sketchbook. The pages were filled with familiar drawings. The train, the passengers, the city. Then he reached a page near the end. His expression changed. Adrian noticed. What is it? Noah hesitated, then turned the sketchbook around. It was a drawing of Adrian. Not in a suit. Not at work. Not looking serious. Just sitting by the train window with his eyes closed. The sunlight touched his face. Beneath it, Noah had written, he looks lonely when nobody is watching. Adrian stared at the words. Noah immediately looked embarrassed. I wasn't trying to be rude. You weren't. He looked down. I thought maybe someone should notice. For years, people had noticed Adrian's success. His wealth. His position. His power. No one had noticed his loneliness. Except Noah, the stranger who slept across from him every Friday. Adrian carefully closed the sketchbook. Noah. When you're better. Noah looked at him. Will you ride the train again? A tiny smile appeared. Adrian pretended to look offended. Maybe. Noah's smile grew slightly. You don't even know if I like trains. You wrote an entire notebook about one. About you. The answer came so quickly that Noah immediately realized what he had said. His face turned pink. Adrian looked away, hiding a smile. For once, the powerful CEO had no clever response. Outside the hospital, the city continued moving. People rushed. Trains arrived. Trains departed. Millions of lives crossed paths every day without ever knowing. But two strangers who once shared 6 months of silence were finally learning the most important thing. Sometimes love doesn't begin with a confession. Sometimes it begins with someone quietly noticing that you are there. And finally, someone staying. Final chapter, home. 3 months later. Friday, 8:15 p.m. The station looked exactly the same. The coffee kiosk still had a long queue. The old violinist still played near the entrance. The electronic board still flickered before announcing the train. Life hadn't paused while Noah recovered. It had simply waited for them to catch up. Noah stood on the platform, one hand resting on the handle of a small overnight bag. He looked healthier now. His cheeks had regained their color. The oxygen tube was gone. He was still thinner than he should be, and his doctor had insisted he avoid overexertion. But he was here, alive. Beside him, Adrian glanced at his watch. You're smiling. Noah looked away. I'm not. You've been smiling since we left the hospital. I have not. You absolutely have. Noah sighed dramatically. I survived a rare illness. Adrian nodded. You did. And now I'm being bullied. Adrian laughed. I prefer teased. The train rolled into the station. The familiar chime echoed through the platform. For a moment, neither of them moved. Noah looked at the last carriage. So, this is where we spent 6 months ignoring each other. Adrian shook his head. I wasn't ignoring you. You never said hello. You were asleep. I could have been pretending. You weren't. Noah blinked. How do you know? Adrian smiled. Because I finally know you. They boarded together. The carriage was quieter than usual. Almost instinctively, Noah walked toward the familiar window seat. Then stopped. Someone else was already sitting there. A teenage boy wearing headphones. Noah smiled. Looks like it's taken. Adrian looked at the seat. Then at Noah. You know, I don't think that was ever the important part. Noah looked at him. Adrian gently took the seat beside the window instead, then patted the place next to him. This one is free. Noah laughed softly before sitting beside him. Their shoulders brushed. Neither moved away. The train began its journey. Outside, city lights painted golden streaks across the glass. Inside, Noah leaned back comfortably. No hospital today. No hospital. No notebook. No notebook. No pretending to sleep. At that, Noah smiled. I might actually fall asleep. Adrian looked at him. If you do, I'll wake you before your station. Noah turned toward him. I know. 3 simple words. But they carried everything that had changed. Halfway through the journey, the conductor walked through the carriage. He paused. His face lit up with recognition. You're feeling better. Noah blinked in surprise. You remember me? The conductor laughed. Of course. You always thank me when I checked your ticket. He looked at Adrian. I was worried after that night. So was I, Adrian admitted. The conductor smiled warmly. It's good to see you home. Home. The word lingered long after he walked away. As the train approached Noah's station, Adrian stood. This isn't our stop. Noah looked confused. It isn't. Adrian shook his head. He gently took Noah's hand. Come with me. The train reached the platform where Noah had always gotten off. The doors opened. Passengers stepped out. New passengers stepped in. The familiar chime sounded. The doors closed. The train moved again. For the first time in 6 months. Noah didn't get off. He looked at Adrian. We missed my station. Adrian smiled. I know. You always got off there because you had to go home alone. He squeezed Noah's hand. You don't have to anymore. Noah's eyes shimmered. So, where are we going? Adrian looked through the window as the city rolled quietly past. Anywhere. As long as it's together. Noah rested his head gently against Adrian's shoulder. This time, he wasn't exhausted. He wasn't escaping pain. He wasn't hiding from the world. He was simply comfortable. Adrian looked down and smiled. Without thinking, he loosened his tie. Noah noticed immediately. I knew you'd do that. Adrian chuckled. You notice everything. No. Noah intertwined their fingers. Just the things that matter. Adrian hummed. Noah finds a good angle to rest his head. Where's your driver? Adrian smiles. I send him home every Friday. Noah blinks. Why? Adrian looks out the train window. Because everyone deserves to get home early once a week. Noah smiles and quietly says, You never told that. Adrian chuckles. That's because you never asked. Outside, rain began to fall, soft enough to blur the city lights into gentle ribbons of gold. The train continued through the night, carrying countless strangers toward their destinations. Once, 2 of those strangers had spent 6 months sharing the same carriage without exchanging a single word. Now, they had all the Fridays ahead of them. Epilogue. Months later, Mrs. Agnes stood in the doorway of apartment 3B, pretending to inspect a flower pot. In reality, she was watching 2 young men inside argue over cookies. Noah, Adrian said, holding up a baking tray. These are burnt. They're artisan. They're charcoal. They have character. Mrs. Agnes laughed so hard that Noah looked up in embarrassment. Grandma Agnes. She smiled, wiping the corners of her eyes. Leave them alone, dear. She looked at Adrian. They've always tasted perfect to me. Adrian broke off a piece and took a bite. He made a thoughtful face, then smiled. They're still terrible. Noah folded his arms. Then don't eat them. I didn't say I wouldn't. He reached for another. Noah laughed. A bright, unrestrained laugh that filled the tiny apartment. The same apartment that had once waited in silence for him to return. It wasn't silent anymore. On the windowsill, Sir Prickles stood proudly with his crooked ribbon. The lilies by the window swayed gently in the breeze. And tucked safely on the bookshelf, the worn blue notebook remained exactly where it belonged. Its final page had ended, but the story it began continued every Friday at 8:15 p.m. The end. Thank you for staying with us until the very last station of this journey. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to BL Eclipse Chronicles for more emotional BL stories filled with love, hope, and unforgettable moments. Tell us in the comments, which moment made your heart ache the most? Until our next story, may every lonely heart find someone who notices the little things that matter. This is BL Eclipse Chronicles, signing off. See you in the next story.